The sun was setting outside the big glass windows, turning the city skyline into a deep orange color. But inside the penthouse, the air was cool and smelled like expensive lemon cleaner. It was the kind of place where everything looked perfect. The furniture was white and modern, the art on the walls was strange but cost a fortune, and the floors were so shiny you could see your reflection in them. It was a world built on money, and Julian Vross was the king of it. Julian sat at his long stone table. He was tapping on a tablet, not really looking at anything important. He looked bored. He was a man who had everything he could buy, so nothing excited him anymore. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He didn't look like a bad person, but he had a cold way of looking at people, as if they were just numbers on a page. Standing near the entrance of the room was Clara. She was holding a feather duster, but she wasn't using it. She was standing very still, looking nervous. Her hands were shaking a little bit. She had worked for Julian's family for 20 years. She had cleaned up his messes since he was a little boy, but today, she wasn't here to clean. She was here to beg. Next to her was her daughter, Tessa. Tessa was young, maybe 22, with dark hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She wasn't wearing a fancy dress. She was wearing a clean button-down shirt and a skirt. She looked neat, but next to the luxury of the room, she looked out of place. Unlike her mother, Tessa wasn't shaking. She was standing straight, her jaw set tight, watching Julian with sharp eyes. "Please, Mr. Julian," Clara said, her voice quiet and trembling. "I know I shouldn't ask. I know we are just the help. But the doctors, they say we need the surgery soon. If we don't pay, I don't know what will happen to my husband." Julian finally looked up. He took his time. He looked at Clara, then at Tessa. He didn't look angry, he just looked uninterested. He leaned back in his leather chair and sighed. "Clara," Julian said. His voice was smooth but hard. "We pay you a salary. You have worked here for a long time. That is the deal. You work, I pay you. I am not a bank. Why should I give you money for your personal problems?" "It's not just a problem," Clara said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "It is his life. Tessa, she tried to get a loan, but the bank said no. We have nowhere else to go." Julian turned his gaze to Tessa. He smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile people use when they think they are better than someone else. "So," Julian said. "The little girl thinks she can just ask for charity. How much do you need? 200,000, 500,000 to you, that is a fortune. To me, it's the price of a small vacation." Tessa stepped forward. She put a hand on her mother's shoulder to calm her down. "We are not asking for charity, Mr. Vross," Tessa said. Her voice was clear and strong. "We are asking for help. My mother has served this family loyally for 2 decades. She made your lunch when you were sick in school. She cleaned this house when your parents passed away. We are asking for humanity." Julian laughed. It was a short, dry sound. "Humanity doesn't keep the lights on, Tessa. Business does. You want money, fine. I like games. Let's play a game." He picked up a thin folder from the table and tossed it. It slid across the smooth stone surface and stopped right in front of Tessa. "Open it," Julian said. Tessa picked up the folder. Inside was a contract. The words were small and filled with legal terms, but the numbers at the bottom were huge. $100 million, Tessa whispered. She looked up, confused. What is this? I have a charity division, Julian explained, spinning a pen between his fingers. It's a mess. The people running it are idiots. They lose money every year. I challenge you to fix it. You have 3 months. If you can triple the value of that portfolio, make it worth $300 million, the money is yours. You can take the profit, pay for the surgery, and keep the rest. Clara gasped. 100, that's impossible. Tessa isn't a businesswoman. She is a student. And if she loses? Julian asked, raising an eyebrow. If you fail, Clara, you both leave. You quit your job. You move out of the city. And you sign a paper saying you will never ask me or my company for anything ever again. You walk away with nothing. Mr. Julian, please, Clara cried out. Don't do this. Tessa stared at the paper. Her mother was crying, soft tears rolling down her cheeks. Tessa looked at Julian. She saw that he was mocking her. He thought a maid's daughter wasn't smart enough to do this. He thought she would be too scared to even try. He wanted to humiliate them, to watch them scramble and fail, just so he could feel powerful. You think I can't do it? Tessa said. It wasn't a question. Julian shrugged. Look around you, Tessa. Look at this room. Look at what I have built. You live in a small apartment downstairs. You clean toilets. What do you know about managing millions? You are a maid's daughter. You will always be a maid's daughter. The words hung in the air. They were meant to hurt. They were meant to remind her that in his eyes, she was nothing. The air conditioning hummed softly in the silence. The city lights outside twinkled, indifferent to the scene happening inside. Tessa looked at her mother's tired face. She thought about her father lying in a hospital bed, worrying about the cost of medicine. She thought about the years of studying late at night while her mother scrubbed floors so Tessa could have a better life. Julian thought this was a joke. He thought he was setting a trap. But Tessa saw an opportunity. Fine, Tessa said. Her voice was so calm that it made Julian stop spinning his pen. Tessa, no, Clara grabbed her arm. It is too risky. It's the only chance, Mom, Tessa said softly. She squeezed her mother's hand and then let go. She turned back to the stone table. She pulled a pen out of her pocket. It was a cheap plastic pen with a chewed-up cap, nothing like the expensive silver pen Julian was holding. She clicked the pen open. Julian watched her, a smirk still on his face. He expected her to hesitate. He expected her hands to shake. But Tessa didn't hesitate. She leaned over the contract. She read the signature line. Tessa Vasquez. She pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed smoothly. She signed her name with a strong, firm stroke. She didn't just write her name, she made a statement. Tessa Vasquez. She clicked the pen closed and tossed the folder back across the table. It slid and hit Julian's water glass with a soft clink. 3 months, Tessa said. She looked Julian right in the eye. Don't blink, or you might miss how it's done. Julian's smirk faltered for just a second. He looked at the signature, then back at the young woman standing in his expensive living room. He felt a strange flicker of doubt, but he pushed it away. He was the billionaire. She was the help. Don't worry about me, Julian said, leaning back and picking up his tablet. Worry about your packing boxes. You're going to need them. Tessa didn't reply. She turned to her mother. Come on, Mom. Let's go. But Tessa, the contract. "It's done," Tessa said. She guided her mother toward the hallway. "We have work to do." They walked out of the room. The hallway was long and lined with mirrors. Tessa walked with her head high. She didn't look back at the luxury, or the marble floors, or the art. She didn't look back at Julian. Julian sat alone at the table. The automatic lights in the hallway flickered on as the women walked away, then flickered off again. He looked at the signature on the paper. It was just a name. But for the first time in a long time, Julian Vross felt like he had lost control of the game before it even started. He tapped the screen of his tablet, but his mind wasn't on his work. He was thinking about the girl with the cheap pen and the eyes that didn't look away. The elevator ride down was long and completely silent. The building had 40 floors, and Tessa spent every second of the descent staring at the reflection of the stainless steel doors. Her mother, Clara, stood beside her, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The weight of the signature on that paper was heavier than the elevator cables. When the doors slid open with a soft chime, the air changed. Upstairs, it smelled of lemon polish and expensive air freshener. Down here, in the sub-basement, the air was cooler and smelled of dust, old paper, and the faint metallic hum of electricity. This was the archive level. It was where the company stored the things they didn't want to look at anymore. Clara stopped walking. She looked at the heavy gray door marked records, authorized personnel only. "You cannot work down here, Tessa," she said, her voice trembling. "It is dark. It is cold. There is no one here to help you." "I don't want help from his people, Mom," Tessa said softly. "Go home. Rest. Dad needs you. I will handle this." Clara wanted to argue, but she saw the look in her daughter's eyes. It was the same look Clara had seen the day Tessa graduated from college, a mix of pride and sheer determination. Clara nodded, kissed Tessa on the cheek, and turned back toward the parking elevators. Tessa watched her mother leave. Once she was alone, she turned to the gray door. She swiped the temporary card Julian had given her. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. The room was huge. Rows of metal shelves stretched up to the low ceiling, packed with boxes and binders. In the center of the room were a few old desks and computer terminals that looked like they were from 20 years ago. There was no view of the city. There were no windows at all. Just the low, steady buzz of the server fans at the back of the room. Tessa walked to the middle desk. She sat in the chair, which squeaked under her weight. She pulled the bulky computer monitor closer to her face. She was alone in the dark, miles away from the glass penthouse above, but she felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't a guest here, she wasn't a beggar. She was just a person with a job to do. For the next 2 weeks, Tessa didn't leave the basement unless she had to. Julian expected her to come to him, to complain about the working conditions or to ask for a better office. He sent emails to her temporary account, mocking messages asking if she was lost, or if the cleaning supplies were locked up. Tessa read them once and deleted them. She didn't reply. Instead, she did the work nobody else wanted to do. Julian's top executives, men in expensive suits with corner offices, ran the charity portfolio like a joke. They threw money at big, flashy events to make themselves look good. But when Tessa looked at the numbers on her dusty screen, she saw the truth. The returns were terrible. The money was disappearing. She spent hours reading through the physical binders on the shelves. Her eyes would burn from the fluorescent lights, and her fingers would turn black from the old newsprint, but she kept going. She was looking for the unsexy projects. She found records of small farming cooperatives in the countryside and local water purification projects that the executives had rejected because they weren't fancy enough. They were labeled high risk. Tessa knew better. She knew that people who worked the land, people like her father, paid their debts. She knew that clean water changed lives more than a fancy dinner party ever could. One afternoon, about 6 weeks in, she made her move. She didn't ask for permission. She logged into the system and redirected $5 million into a network of sustainable farming cooperatives. It was a drop in the bucket compared to Julian's wealth, but it was a massive risk for her. Then, she waited. Upstairs in the penthouse, Julian was having a meeting with his board. The coffee was hot, and the pastries were imported. He was laughing, telling them about the little joke he was playing on the maid's daughter. "She is probably scrubbing the archives by now," Julian joked. "It keeps her busy." Just then, his tablet buzzed. A message from the finance department. He frowned and tapped the screen. It was an alert about an unusual transfer in the charity fund. He swiped the notification away without reading it deeply, assuming it was an error. He didn't even realize the transfer had come from Tessa's account. 2 weeks passed. The numbers on the screen began to change. It wasn't a loud change at first. It was a slow, steady climb. The farming cooperatives didn't just survive, they thrived. The crops were good, and the local markets were booming. The financial derivatives attached to the crops began to rise in value. Tessa sat in the basement, watching the green line on the graph go up. She didn't celebrate. She just took a sip of lukewarm water from her bottle and kept working. She was winning the game, but she wasn't playing it for fun. She was playing for her mother, her father, and every person who had ever been looked down upon by someone like Julian. The trouble started when the executives noticed the jump in numbers. "Who is managing the charity fund?" one of the senior vice presidents asked during a Monday morning meeting. "The returns are up 12% this month." "That's impossible." Julian looked up from his coffee. "What?" "The agriculture sector," another executive said, looking at his phone. "Someone put money into those small farms. The ones we thought were dead weight. They are performing better than the tech stocks." Julian felt a cold spot in his stomach. He stood up. "Get me the access logs. I want to know who made that trade." 10 minutes later, Julian was storming out of the boardroom. He didn't take the elevator to his office. He went straight for the service elevator, the one the staff used. He rode it down to the sub-basement, his tie feeling loose around his neck. He was angry. He wanted to catch her making a mistake. He wanted to prove that she had gotten lucky once and that she was failing now. The elevator doors opened. The smell of old dust hit him. He walked down the narrow aisle between the metal shelves. The hum of the servers was loud here. He found her sitting at the old desk. She had her legs crossed, a stack of papers on one side and a sandwich on the other. She was typing with one hand and eating with the other. She looked comfortable. She looked like she belonged there. "You," Julian said. His voice echoed in the large room. Tessa stopped typing. She didn't jump, she didn't look scared. She slowly finished chewing her bite of sandwich, wiped her mouth with a napkin, and turned to face him. She didn't stand up. She just looked at him, waiting for him to speak. "The agriculture fund," Julian snapped, walking closer to her desk. "Did you do that?" "Yes," Tessa said simply. "It was a good investment." It wasn't your decision to make, Julian yelled. He slammed his hand on the desk. The sound was sharp and loud, startling a few moths that were flying near the ceiling light. You are down here to file papers, Tessa. You are not a traitor. You are not a strategist. You are the help. Tessa looked at his hand on the desk, then up at his face. Her expression didn't change. The contract gave me full authority over the portfolio, Julian. Read it again. It said I make the strategy. That is the strategy. It is a fluke, Julian hissed. It will crash. Those people, they don't know how to handle money. They know how to grow food, Julian, Tessa said, her voice steady. They know how to work hard. That is more than I can say for your board of directors. Julian stared at her. He was used to people looking away when he got angry. He was used to them apologizing. But Tessa just watched him with those calm, dark eyes. She wasn't intimidated by his suit or his money. Down here, in the dusty basement with the buzzing servers, none of that mattered. This doesn't change anything, Julian said, straightening his jacket. He felt flustered, and he hated it. You have 2 months left. You will fail. Maybe, Tessa said, turning back to her computer screen. But the numbers are looking good today. You should check them. Julian stood there for a moment longer. He looked around the gray, windowless room. He looked at the cheap sandwich and the plastic water bottle. For a second, he felt very small. He realized that while he was upstairs worrying about stock prices and appearances, the daughter of his maid was quietly building something real. He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back to the elevator. When the doors closed, blocking out the hum of the servers, he leaned his head against the cold metal wall. He realized he wasn't playing a game against a fool. He was playing a game against someone who was smarter than him. And for the first time in years, Julian Vross was scared he might lose. The third month began, and the basement didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It felt like a command center. Tessa had claimed the space. She had moved the dusty boxes aside to clear a workspace on the floor. She had taped a few charts to the gray metal walls, colorful lines showing profits that were climbing higher every day. She wasn't just winning the game, she was rewriting the rules. But she knew that people like Julian didn't lose gracefully. Julian's executives were angry. They sat in their glass-walled offices upstairs, drinking artisan coffee and watching Tessa's progress on their screens. It made them look bad. A young woman with no fancy degree from an Ivy League school, a woman who they had seen cleaning tables in the break room, was doing a better job than they were. They couldn't let it stand. They didn't fight her with words, they fought her with silence. On a Tuesday morning, Tessa went to log into the main system to transfer some funds for a new housing project. She typed her password. The screen flashed red. Access denied. She tried again. Access denied. Her heart beat a little faster. She picked up her phone and called the IT help desk. They didn't answer. She called the finance department. They transferred her to voicemail. She had been cut off. It was a calculated move. Without access to the digital system, she couldn't make trades. She couldn't prove her work. Julian and his team thought they had trapped her. They thought she would panic. They thought she would run upstairs screaming and crying, demanding to be let back in. Instead, Tessa sat back in her chair and took a deep breath. She looked at the blank screen and smiled. She realized that by locking her out of the computer, they had made a mistake. They had forgotten that business, at its core, isn't about computers. It's about people. Tessa packed her bag. She left the basement and took the elevator up to the ground floor, but she didn't go to the executive suites. She went to the cafeteria. It was lunchtime, and the room was buzzing with noise. The air smelled of soup and fresh bread. The room was filled with hundreds of workers, secretaries, assistants, junior analysts, security guards. These were the people the executives ignored. These were the people who actually kept the company running. Tessa walked to the center of the room. She didn't have a microphone, but she didn't need one. She had grown up watching her mother navigate a room. She knew how to command attention. She stood on a chair. "Everyone!" she called out. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was strong. "Can I have a minute?" The room went quiet. People looked up from their trays. They knew who she was. They knew she was Clara's daughter, the girl who was fighting the billionaire. "They locked me out of the system," Tessa told them honestly. "The executives are trying to stop me because they are embarrassed. But I can finish this work without their fancy computers. I just need to know what is happening on the ground. I need to know which projects are real and which ones are fake." She looked around the room. "I know you guys see the things they don't. I know you hear the whispers in the hallways. If you help me get this data, I won't forget it. And if I win this challenge, I'm going to make sure every single one of you gets a bonus that the executives have been keeping for themselves." A young man in a delivery uniform stood up. "I saw the reports for the city water project," he said. "My cousin works on the site. He said they finished it 2 weeks early. They are just waiting for the money to release the water." An older woman at the coffee station nodded. "The logistics manager, he hides the bad numbers in the miscellaneous folder every Friday. I have the keys to the file cabinet." One by one, they stood up. They didn't do it for Julian. They did it for Clara. They all remembered the times Clara had covered for them when they were sick, or the times she had given them her own lunch because they forgot theirs. Loyalty, Tessa learned, is earned with kindness, not money. For the next 2 weeks, the company basement turned into a hive of activity. It wasn't digital, it was analog. It was human. Tessa sat at her desk with a mountain of paper. Secretaries brought her printed copies of emails. Security guards brought her thumb drives with backup files. Junior analysts sneaked her handwritten notes from meetings they weren't supposed to attend. She spent her nights cross-referencing everything. She built a new portfolio on her laptop, completely separate from the main system. She used the information the little people gave her. She found out that the executives had been draining money from the successful projects to cover up their failures in the bad ones. It was a mess. But Tessa knew how to clean up messes. She had done it her whole life. Julian, meanwhile, was walking through the hallways with a smirk on his face. He asked his assistants, "Has she quit yet?" They said no, but he didn't believe them. He thought she was just hiding in the basement, waiting for the deadline to pass so she could slink away in shame. He didn't know that she was building a case against him. Tessa realized that Julian's challenge had been a trap, but she also realized something deeper. The challenge was about humiliation. He wanted to prove that money equals intelligence. He wanted to prove that people like her mother didn't matter. So, Tessa decided to change the game completely. She wasn't just going to make money, she was going to change the culture. She used her new data to make a bold move. She shifted the remaining funds away from the high-risk vanity projects the executives loved like the shiny new art center and poured it all into community support. She funded medical debt relief for the workers in the factories the company owned. She funded child care for the single parents in their warehouses. It was a radical move. The executives would hate it. It wasn't glamorous. But it was the right thing to do. And strangely, the financial models Tessa ran showed that it would work. Happy workers are productive workers. Healthy communities buy more products. It was simple logic that the billionaires in their glass tower had forgotten. The day before the deadline, Tessa printed everything. She had a stack of papers 3 inches thick. It was the truth. It was the proof of the sabotage, the proof of the success of her projects, and the proof that Julian's executives were incompetent. She looked at the stack of paper. She thought about her father in the hospital. She thought about her mother scrubbing floors until her hands were raw. She thought about the way Julian looked at her, like she was dirt. She picked up the papers and walked toward the elevator. She pressed the button for the top floor. The ride up felt different this time. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't the maid's daughter going to beg. She was a woman coming to collect a debt. When the doors opened, the office was quiet. It was late, and most of the cleaning staff had gone home except for her mother, who was in the corner emptying the trash bins in the main lobby. Clara saw Tessa step out of the elevator holding the stack of papers. She saw the look on her daughter's face, calm, focused, unstoppable. Clara dropped her trash bag. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, holding her cleaning cart, with tears welling in her eyes. She knew that whatever happened tomorrow, her daughter had already won. Tessa didn't need the money to be great anymore. She had proven it to herself, to the workers, and now, she was going to prove it to the king. The big conference room was different today. Usually, it was a place where quiet men in suits made decisions about millions of dollars without raising their voices. But today, the air felt thick. Every chair along the long glass table was filled. There were investors, board members, and the top executives of Julian's company. Even the people who usually stayed in the background were here, leaning against the walls, watching. At the head of the table sat Julian. He looked calm, confident. He wore a suit that fitted him perfectly, and he tapped his pen rhythmically on the polished surface. He believed he had won. He had spent the last week telling anyone who would listen that Tessa's silence meant she had failed. He assumed she was too embarrassed to show her face. "Let's get started," Julian said, his voice echoing slightly off the glass walls. "We have a lot to cover. And I believe we need to discuss the future of the charity division, which has unfortunately been mismanaged recently." He stood up. He walked over to a large screen on the wall and picked up a remote control. "Before we bring in the consultant," Julian said, pausing as if searching for a polite word, "I want to show you the projections I have prepared. My team has analyzed the market. We believe that if we cut the risky community programs and focus on high-end corporate sponsorship, we can save the fund." He pressed a button. A graph appeared on the screen. It looked impressive. Lines going up, numbers in green. The people around the table nodded. They were impressed. They wanted to believe Julian. He was the billionaire. He was the expert. "As you can see," Julian continued, pointing at the screen with the remote, "the previous strategy was a disaster. The person in charge of the portfolio for the last 3 months had no experience. She was, let's just say, out of her depth." The door at the back of the room opened. It wasn't a loud sound, but the energy in the room shifted instantly. Everyone turned their heads. Tessa walked in. She wasn't wearing the borrowed blazer she had worn the first day. She was wearing a simple, clean dress. She carried a thick folder under her arm. She didn't look at the floor. She didn't look at Julian. She looked straight ahead, walking with a steady pace toward the other end of the table. Julian lowered the remote. He smiled at her, a tight, fake smile. "Ah, Tessa. Thank you for joining us. We were just reviewing the failure of your project. Please, take a seat. You can watch how the professionals fix your mess." Tessa didn't sit. She walked to the front of the room, standing right in front of the screen where Julian's graph was glowing. "I'm not here to watch, Julian," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the silent room, it carried power. "I'm here to present the results." Julian laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. "Results you haven't logged into the system in weeks. My team locked you out. You have no data." "I have all the data I need," Tessa said. She placed her folder on the table and opened it. "You assumed that because I didn't have access to your digital servers, I couldn't work. You forgot that business is done by people, not computers." She pulled out a small device and plugged it into the projector cable hanging from the table. Julian's green graph vanished. In its place, a new image appeared. It was a spreadsheet, but it was unlike anything the investors had seen. It was detailed. It was granular. It was huge. "What is this?" one of the board members asked, squinting at the screen. "This is the real performance of the portfolio," Tessa said. She pressed a button, and the numbers began to move. "You see, while you were busy locking me out and planning corporate galas, I was on the ground. I used the information from your own staff, the people you ignore every day." She clicked again. A chart appeared showing the agricultural project. "You called this high risk. I called it necessary. In the last 3 months, this project has not only tripled in value, but it has also stabilized the food supply for 3 regions. The stock derivative attached to it is the best performing asset in your entire company." The room was dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming. The investors leaned forward. They knew numbers. They knew when they were looking at a winner. Julian's face turned a shade of pale red. He gripped the edge of the table. "This is a mistake," he snapped. "Those numbers are inflated. They are based on projected growth, not real cash." "Are they?" Tessa asked softly. She reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. She didn't hand them to Julian. She handed them to the head of the investment bank, a serious-looking man sitting halfway down the table. "These are the bank transfer confirmations," Tessa said to the room. "The contracts were signed by your own legal team 3 weeks ago. You didn't read the fine print, Julian. You were too busy trying to humiliate me. The challenge gave me full authority. I didn't just make the profits on paper. I liquidated the assets at the peak of the market yesterday." The banker flipped through the pages. His eyes went wide. He looked up at Tessa, then at Julian. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Vross, these transfers are valid. The funds have been moved. The profit is substantial." "How much?" Julian whispered, though he didn't really want to know. "The portfolio started with 100 million, Tessa said, her voice clear as a bell. As of yesterday at 4 p.m., it is worth $340 million. A collective gasp went through the room. 340 million. Not only had she hit the target, she had destroyed it. Julian stumbled back as if he had been physically pushed. That's impossible. You cheated. You stole the money. I didn't steal anything, Tessa said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver recorder. She held it up for the room to see. I have a recording of the day we made the deal, Julian. You offered the challenge. You set the terms. You said if I tripled the money, it was mine. You told me that if I won, you would sign it over. She pressed play on the device. Julian's voice filled the room, crisp and clear. Triple the value, and the money is yours. I am a man of my word, Tessa. Even for the help. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian looked around the room. His executives wouldn't meet his eyes. They were looking at the table, or at the screen, or at Tessa. They knew he was beaten. He had been outplayed by the woman he tried to crush. Tessa walked over to the table where Julian was standing. She towered over him, not because she was tall, but because she was standing on the truth. The money is already gone from your corporate accounts, she told him quietly. I have transferred the profit, the $240 million, into an irrevocable trust. It pays for my father's medical bills immediately. It sets up a scholarship fund for the children of every service worker in this building. And it funds the community projects you were going to cut. Julian stared at her. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked smaller than he ever had. He looked like a man who realized his castle was built on sand. You can't do this, he finally choked out. I will sue you. I will bury you in lawyers. You can try, Tessa said, putting the recorder back in her pocket. But the contract is binding. And I think your investors might be more interested in keeping the person who just made them $240 million in 3 months than they are in your ego. She turned to face the room. She didn't look like a maid's daughter anymore. She looked like a leader. My work here is done. The funds are secure, the contracts are signed. I suggest you all look closely at the trust documents I emailed you. It's the future of this company. She turned and walked toward the door. The room was frozen. No one moved to stop her. No one said a word. They just watched her go. Julian stood alone by the screen with his failed graph, watching the empty space where she had stood. The game was over, and he had lost everything. The meeting in the glass room had ended, but the feeling in the building had changed completely. As Tessa walked out, she didn't look back at the stunned investors or the pale face of the man who had tried to break her. She walked through the quiet hallways, her heels clicking softly on the floor. The air felt lighter now. The heavy pressure that had been sitting on her chest for 3 months was gone. She took the elevator down to the ground floor. She didn't go to her basement office. She went to the janitorial wing, a small room in the back of the building that the executives never visited. It was a simple space with concrete walls, a row of lockers, and a small table where the staff kept their lunch boxes. Her mother, Clara, was there. She was sitting on a wooden bench, her head in her hands. She looked up when she heard the door open. Her eyes were red and puffy. She had been crying. Clara stood up quickly, wiping her face with her apron. What happened? Did you lose? Is Mr. Julian angry? Tessa walked over to her mother and hugged her. It was a long, tight hug. We won, Mom, she whispered. We won. The money is ours. Dad's surgery is paid for. Everything is going to be okay. Clara pulled back, looking at her daughter's face to see if she was joking. When she saw the calm happiness in Tessa's eyes, Clara let out a sob and collapsed back onto the bench, covering her mouth with her hands. She was crying tears of relief now. The nightmare was over. They spent the next hour packing Clara's things. It didn't take long. A few photos from inside the locker, a worn-out sweater, a thermos. 20 years of work in a building that treated her like invisible machinery, and her whole life fit into a small cardboard box. Tessa picked up the box. "Come on, Mom. Let's go." They walked out of the janitorial room and into the main lobby. The lobby was huge and fancy, with marble floors and a high ceiling that made people feel small. Usually, at this time of day, the lobby was busy with secretaries and delivery people. But today, it was strangely quiet. Word of the meeting had spread fast. The staff knew what had happened. They stood behind the reception desks and near the security gates, watching. Tessa and Clara walked toward the main exit. The automatic glass doors were just a few feet away. They were almost free. "Wait." The voice wasn't loud, but it stopped them. It was a familiar voice. It was a voice that usually gave orders and expected them to be followed instantly. Tessa turned around. Julian was standing at the top of the grand staircase that led down to the lobby. He looked different. His suit jacket was unbuttoned. His tie was loose. He didn't look like the powerful billionaire who owned the city. He looked like a tired man. He walked down the stairs slowly. He held onto the railing, as if he needed it to keep his balance. The security guards near the door stepped forward, ready to stop him if he caused a scene, but Tessa waved them back. She wanted to hear what he had to say. Julian stopped a few feet away from them. He looked at Clara, then at Tessa. He cleared his throat, but for a moment, he couldn't speak. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people who told him he was brilliant, people who were afraid of him. He had never faced anyone who had honestly beaten him. I checked the numbers," Julian said quietly. "The lawyers confirmed it. The trust is valid. The transfers went through." Clara clutched her purse tighter, shrinking back a little. She was still afraid of him. "I'm sorry," Julian said. The words hung in the air. They were simple words, but coming from him, they sounded heavy and awkward. "I treated you poorly," Julian said, looking directly at Tessa. "I thought this was a game. I thought I was better than you. I was wrong. You are smarter than any of the people I pay millions of dollars to. You won fair and square." Tessa watched him closely. She wasn't looking for an apology, but she was glad to see that he was humble enough to give one. It meant she hadn't just beaten his wallet, she had reached his humanity. "Thank you, Julian," Tessa said simply. "But don't apologize to me. Apologize to her." She gestured to her mother. Julian turned to look at Clara. He saw the woman who had cleaned his floors for 2 decades. He saw her worn hands and her tired eyes. He realized he had never really looked at her before. She had just been part of the furniture. "Clara," Julian said, his voice cracking. "I am sorry. I should have helped you when you asked. I should have taken care of your husband. I failed you as an employer and as a human being." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She didn't nod, and she didn't smile. She just looked at him with a sad, peaceful expression. "You did, Mr. Julian," she said softly. "But my daughter fixed it. That is all that matters now." Julian nodded slowly. He felt a strange hollowness in his chest. He realized that all his money, all his power, couldn't buy him the respect or the loyalty that Clara had for Tessa. He stood there, alone in his expensive lobby, while the two women stood together as a family. "Goodbye, Julian," Tessa said. She turned and walked toward the glass doors. They slid open automatically, letting in the noise of the city horns honking, people talking, the sound of life. Clara walked beside her. They stepped out of the building and onto the sidewalk. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the street. The air was fresh and smelled of food from the street vendors nearby. Tessa took a deep breath. She felt the weight of the last few months lift off her shoulders. She thought about the basement, the dusty archives, the long nights, and the fear. But it was all behind her now. "You okay, Mom?" Tessa asked. Clara smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She linked her arm through her daughter's arm. "I am wonderful, Tessa. I am free." They walked down the sidewalk together, blending into the crowd. They didn't look like billionaires or celebrities. They looked like a mother and daughter going home. But they walked with their heads held high. Inside the building, Julian stood by the glass doors, watching them go. He watched until they turned the corner and disappeared from sight. The lobby was empty again. The silence was loud. He walked over to a pillar and leaned his forehead against the cool marble. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the door. For the first time in his life, he didn't see a genius. He didn't see a king. He saw a lonely man who had everything, yet had nothing. The elevator dinged behind him, and the sound echoed through the vast, empty space. Julian closed his eyes. The challenge was over. The game was done. And in the silence of his empire, he finally learned the lesson he never wanted to learn, that money can buy you power, but it cannot buy you class, and it certainly cannot buy you a heart.